All right, I'm going to be discussing eating animal flesh or meat, however you want to refer to it. But before doing so, I want to make it clear that this is a subject where I really don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not sure anybody does, but I definitely don't. I prove that to myself through my own experience. So while some of my other recordings and videos might be presenting circumstantial evidence, and I have a pretty strong leaning towards one explanation or hypothesis that comes through the recording, here you should not be able to intuit that kind of certainty because I don't have it. What do I mean? Well, for those of you who don't know, I was a strict vegetarian for 7 years. I got into all the usual information that everybody else does, watched all the usual documentaries, and on top of all that, had what the mainstream would refer to as a psychic interaction with animals. Direct communication. That really, on top of everything that I had learned, all those documentaries I had watched on slaughterhouses and factory farms and just the whole thing, on top of all that, now I'm communicating with this animal, and it just became apparent, okay, there's no way that I should be eating these creatures. And I felt this truth in my heart and soul as deep as you can take that. I believed that this was the truth and that I was doing the right thing. So I was a strict vegetarian. You know, a lot of people claim that they are vegans and they present themselves as that on the internet in order to make money because it's a good business given the fact that it is being promoted by the algorithms via social media. So if you can make a good case that you are a vegan and promote that lifestyle, the internet will reward you in that way. If you are able to convey it and make people believe that you are about that, you will be promoted and make money doing that. And there's all kinds of cases over the years where people claiming to be a vegan or a breatharian, for example, has been exposed. There's a famous example that I mentioned in a really old recording about this guy who claimed he was a breatharian in the 80s and 90s, and eventually he got caught coming out of a fast food restaurant with a bag of food. And it was kind of over at that point. But a lot of these people have been caught in similar ways. You know, they claim that they're a vegan, and then, oh, here's a video of them eating fish at a restaurant where they didn't know that they were being recorded. And then they have to come out and explain that and try to make some sort of case to keep the gravy train rolling, as it were. But because I actually believed this in the core of my being, I was strict about it. I never cheated. I did not eat a piece of meat for 7 years. And then, of course, as most of you know, my body collapsed from this. And I've gone into why that happened, so I won't regurgitate that again here. Instead, I want to talk about the last 2 years during which I have been eating meat again. In other words, now I have the ability to compare the 7 years when I didn't eat meat to the 2 years now that I have been eating meat, during which time I've been self-aware of everything that's going on. And I can compare and contrast how my being was in these two different time periods and try to gain some insight into what the effects of eating meat actually are, at least for me, right? I am a European American. My ancestry is, as far as I know, I've never submitted anything to those testing sites because why would you do that? But as far as I know, based on what my family has told me, both sides are of European ancestry. At one point, each side of my family came over from Europe to America. And so for me, as a European American with that genetic structure, not eating meat had catastrophic effects on me. But I want to make it clear that if you have a different genetic structure, maybe that's not necessarily the case for you. I don't know. It could be, because we're all human beings that share a lot of the same characteristics and genetics, obviously. But maybe there is slight differences in genetic structures along these lines that would allow someone to thrive as a vegan if they are different from me in some way. I don't know, that's possible. Just want to make that clear from the outset that I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that or experiment in that way. As I said, it seems to me like no one knows what the optimal human diet is. So we're kind of all making this up as we go along. There's so much information and disinformation that it's just a lot to wade through. Because it is clouded by the subjective anecdotes of people who are experimenting with their bodies. And you can be in euphoria stages with this stuff when you first cut out a lot of the processed poison food. You can be in euphoric states and then you're giving testimonies associating that with the diet that you're on. And that's why you can find strict carnivores or paleo type adherents who will swear up and down that this is the optimal human diet and they've never felt better. And you can find the exact same sort of testimonials on the other side who claim that they're a fruitarian and they've never felt better. And that makes it very difficult because, like me, these people genuinely believe that the diet is responsible for what they're feeling. And that genuineness comes across in their testimonial, and then that adds to your belief that maybe this is what I should be doing. Or it increases the likelihood that this is something that you will try. That's just a natural human instinct. We follow people in that way. When we feel like they're being genuine and they are swearing up and down about something. I mean, really, that explains all propaganda. That is how they sell us all of these things that don't necessarily benefit us, but they are able to contextualize it in the way that I'm describing here and make people believers. So anyway, now that I've described all that, I want to get into specifically how I have perceived eating meat as it relates to the effect that it has on my being, on my state of mind. And the first thing that I noticed was sort of a confirmation of what a lot of people say about eating meat, which is this theory, this hypothesis that when you eat the flesh of an animal who was in a factory farm setting, there's so much terror and fear and just despair in those beings when they are killed and processed, that energy is infused into the flesh in some way, shape, or form that we're not consciously able to prove yet, with the current level of understanding that we're allowed to have in mainstream circles, right? The idea is that infusion into the flesh is then infused into you when you consume it. And on the surface, that seems like a very plausible situation. Knowing what we know about how energy works and how it is exchanged between two living beings. Based on my own experience, I think there is probably something to that. Even though I was searching out sources of animal flesh that were not coming from that kind of source, a factory farm, The first thing I noticed when I started eating meat again was that my emotions became stronger. And my attachment to the physical world became stronger. Right away, I noticed that my emotions were just a little bit more out of control, especially when I first started. And it wasn't necessarily anger or fear or anything like that. It was just all of my emotions, all the usual emotions that you experience on a daily basis were just heightened a little. I felt more alive in that way, more in tune with the physical world. It grounded me in that way. But at the same time, it made me a little bit more likely to get out of control with my emotions, feeling something one way or another. And this was very difficult in the beginning for me to get a handle on it. Having come from not experiencing that for 7 years and being very familiar with my state of being, to going into a more unpredictable state of affairs, that was a big adjustment. But it's hard to pin down one thing that was causing that because there was so much else going on at the same time. There's so many different factors that it's difficult to say, oh, this is what it is, or this is what it does. But as far as what it has done regarding the thing that I was the most concerned about, which is that connection to creation that is continually informing your intuition and giving you insights into things that you would have had no ability to perceive prior to being awakened in this way. As I said before, I had always associated that sort of intuition with not eating meat because that came online for me at around the same time that I cut it out of my diet. If I'm being honest, I do feel a little less pure of a connection in that way. I do feel a little more disconnected, though at the same time I'm still in tune, as it were, with what's going on, and I'm still receiving insight, but I feel a little less pure of a connection. And like I said, at the same time, I care more about the physical world. I care more about what's going on with reality, and I don't know if that's some kind of primal thing that's going on, some kind of primal genetic programming that I'm tapping into by eating animal flesh again, that is making me more concerned with the survival of the human species. And again, that's tough to say because of what has also transpired in the 2 years that I coincidentally also started eating meat during. This intelligence came out in the open with its plans for the future. And obviously that produced a similar reaction where it's like, okay, I cannot ignore this given what I know. I must talk about this and explain what's going on or I won't be able to sleep at night. And so that moved me towards caring more about what was going on in the world, paying attention to the news more, reading more, watching more videos online. And that type of thing can disconnect you too from what I'm talking about here. I notice that happening all the time. That's why I take significant breaks from the internet. At a certain point, you just start spiraling out of control and the energy of the internet just grabs a hold of you and sucks you into it. It just sucks you into the negativity and the anxiety of it. Even when you're listening to people that are claiming to be giving you the truth, it just sucks you into this mentality where you lose hope. And that's by design, of course, even with people who are not intentionally trying to convey that to you. That's just the nature of the information. And of course, there are the distorters who are pumping that sort of thing nonstop on purpose to produce that very reaction, because that plays a role in the larger machinations of what they're pulling strings here and there to achieve. So I don't know, you see what I mean, hopefully, how it's difficult to pin down one thing or another as the cause of something when it's so many different factors at work. But no doubt I noticed an impact on my state of being when I started eating meat again. And going back to the primal idea, I don't know, is this the way it's supposed to be, or is this not the way it's supposed to be? And again, this is a question that I'm just not capable of answering as a dumb human. You can look at one side of it in the way that you would look at a terrarium, a closed ecosystem. And you could say, well, human beings are the apex predators here, and we keep all of the other living beings in check as it relates to their population size. Anytime that their populations are seemingly getting out of control, well, we are the apex predator hunters that keep all of the animals in check as it relates to their growth. And that way you keep the self-contained environment known as planet Earth in check. You keep that system in balance, put another way. In other words, I could see the case that is made when someone says, well, God or the Creator made us in its image and gave us dominion over the earth and instructed us to eat animals because it serves this function. That would be the more biblical interpretation. But then at the same time, it's interesting. I don't know if you've seen Darren Aronofsky's Noah, but there's a lot of references in there, which all of this was pre-flood or pre-fall, or most of it anyway. And the disconnected humans, the way he depicts them, the way he depicts the ones who needed to be cleansed from the earth, they say at a couple of different points in time through their dialogue that, oh, I need to eat these creatures to gain my strength back. And then even at one point, Noah, who doesn't engage in this, says, oh, they're deluded. They think they need to eat these creatures to survive. So that adds a little bit of complexity to what I'm talking about here, because maybe there was a point in time where things were different and the physiology was different. The way we were absorbing energy from the environment was different, meaning we would not have to eat creatures. And perhaps that's sort of the cognitive dissonance that is within our genetic programming. When we tap into those memories, maybe we have this cognitive dissonance where it's like, okay, I know deep in my heart that this shouldn't be going on. We shouldn't be needing to do this. But then at the same time, there's all this evidence on the other side that says, well, this is how you survive as a species. You have to do this. And that gets into the whole B12 thing and needing that in order for your nervous system to function and not producing it internally, having to get it from your diet. Was that always the way it was? Or was that some sort of genetic tinkering that changed us in this way, that created the food chain, that creates this cycle of misery on this planet? And then again, you think, oh, human beings are the apex predator, but maybe given what the powers that be state in all of their writings, perhaps there is another apex predator in a different dimension that keeps human beings' population in line when they get out of control. And if you look at it from that perspective, it would explain their actions. Trust me, I know the feeling of looking at the situation here, especially as it relates to the food chain, and just thinking this is some type of hell-like realm, surely. What intelligence or creator or God would come up with this? And again, perhaps there's some type of closed ecosystem population control argument. But again, you could look at that situation and say, well, if I'm the creator, if I'm God and I have this unlimited capacity to create, why would I make it like that? Surely I could make the same type of enclosed ecosystem that was in balance in a way where the beings didn't have to eat each other to survive. So I don't know. Again, like I said, this is something that is pure speculation in all directions. But eating the meat has definitely made me more aggressive as well. And it's similar to what I was talking about. Maybe this is primal in some way. It's making me aggressive in how I feel about people trying to do things to human beings. And it's making me more protective in that way. And that's an interesting thing to consider in the context of how the plant-based vegan lifestyle is being so promoted by the powers that be. That intelligence is really promoting that as we go forward here. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, that makes a lot of sense because I was much more docile before I started eating meat again. And that would be a good state of being for slavery, right? So we can see why that is maybe being promoted in the way that it's being promoted. Generations of vegans might eventually just stop being able to reproduce entirely. I mean, this is one of the arguments that the other side uses. They say, well, there's no example in history of a vegan culture that has sustained multiple generations. Speaking of depopulation agendas, but just in the meantime, that would take many generations to transpire, most likely. In the meantime, people would be getting weaker and weaker and weaker. Especially if you raised a child from birth as a vegan. Because along the same lines, it's definitely made also my reproductive urges, let's say, become way more intense since I started eating meat again. And that took a lot to get under control. I wasn't used to that type of urge being present. And of course, looking at it broadly, there could be other explanations for that. I'm getting a little older. Maybe this is my body's way of saying, hey, if you're going to reproduce, you need to do so pretty soon. Let's get this rolling again and get you thinking about doing that again. So maybe you'll take action and seek out a female to reproduce with. I mean, it could be partially related to that. I don't know. But intuitively, I feel like it's more related to the effect that the animal flesh has on the body when you consume it. Because if you think of it in genetic terms and evolutionary terms, someone who was eating a lot of meat in that way would be in a position to reproduce. That would be evolutionarily selected. Someone who was eating a lot of meat. And you can see how maybe we've spiraled out of control, especially in America, where people eat meat 3 times a day in a lot of places, which is very excessive, but you can see how that interrelates with pornography and the promotion of sex in general all over media, and how it's created this insane human being in America that is so consumed with all of that, and is probably encapsulated in the way Idiocracy did it the best, where Dax Shepard's character is just sitting on the couch and someone knocks on the door and he says, "Come back later, baitin'." Like that's going to be the ultimate result here of where we're headed. This sort of zombified state of most people. And then the last issue with drawing conclusions here is that my body is still healing. I'm not totally back to normal yet, so it's hard to judge completely what the effects on my state of being are as it relates to eating meat. I'll need to get fully healthy and then really look at my abilities, especially from an intuitive sense or a communication sense going forward from there, where I'll really have the strong signal to tell what is affecting me and what isn't. So that's it. Really no point that I had to make other than I just wanted to share this experience. And maybe that'll get you thinking about how what you're consuming is impacting you in a similar way. And that goes for everything, not just food, right? Anyways, catch you later.